The North Atlantic, July 1940. Captain-Lieutenant Otto Kretschmer stood on the conning tower of U-99, scanning the horizon with binoculars as the summer twilight painted the sea in shades of violet and gold. The air was crisp, filled with salt spray and the smell of diesel fuel. Below him, his crew worked efficiently in the cramped spaces of their Type 7 U-boat, confident men who had already tasted success against British merchant shipping. They had every reason to be confident. This was what the German submariners were calling die glückliche Zeit, the happy time, and for good reason. In these summer months of 1940, German U-boats were having their way with Allied shipping. The mathematics was simple and brutal. From July to October, 282 Allied ships would sink beneath these waters, taking with them nearly 1.5 million gross registered tons of desperately needed supplies. The U-boat commanders were becoming celebrities back home, their names household words in the Reich. Günther Prien, who had daringly penetrated the British naval base at Scapa Flow and torpedoed the battleship Royal Oak. Joachim Schepke in U-100, aggressive and deadly. And Kretschmer himself, who had become the most successful U-boat commander of the entire war, with 47 ships and 274,000 tons to his credit. The odds were stacked overwhelmingly in their favour, and they knew it. The fall of France in June had changed everything. German U-boats no longer had to make the dangerous journey around Scotland to reach the Atlantic hunting grounds. Now they operated from captured French ports like Brest, Lorient, La Pallice and Saint-Nazaire. These bases sat right on the Atlantic, slashing transit times and putting the submarines within easy striking distance of the British merchant routes. What had once taken days now took hours. The operational range had effectively doubled overnight. But there was more to their confidence than geography. The British were vulnerable in ways that seemed almost incomprehensible. The Royal Navy had suffered terrible losses during the Norway campaign and the evacuation at Dunkirk. Destroyers and escort vessels, the very ships meant to protect convoys, had been sunk or damaged by the hundreds. The ships that remained were spread impossibly thin, trying to defend an island nation that depended absolutely on seaborne trade for survival. Britain imported more than 1 million tons of food and materials every single week. Without those supplies, the island would starve, and the war effort would collapse. Everyone understood this. Winston Churchill himself would later say that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. The German commanders had developed tactics that exploited every British weakness. Their preferred method was devastatingly simple. They operated on the surface at night, when their low silhouettes made them nearly invisible against the dark water. The merchant ships they hunted were often silhouetted against the lighter horizon, or, even better, against the glow of cities on the coast that stubbornly refused to implement blackouts. A surfaced U-boat had another tremendous advantage. It was fast, capable of 17 or 18 knots, often faster than the merchant ships themselves and sometimes faster than the escorts. And the British detection equipment, a device called ASDIC that used sound waves underwater, was completely useless against a surface submarine. ASDIC could only detect U-boats when they were submerged, sending out pulses of sound through the water and listening for echoes. A submarine running on the surface was invisible to this technology, just another small vessel on a dark ocean. Kretschmer had refined the night surface attack to an art form. His signature move was breathtakingly audacious. When he found a convoy, he would position U-99 ahead of the merchant ships and wait for darkness. Then, as night fell, he would drive straight into the convoy formation itself, slipping between the escorting destroyers in the confusion and darkness. Once inside the protective screen, he was surrounded by targets. The merchant ships loomed up on all sides, huge and slow and helpless. He would fire torpedo after torpedo, sometimes sinking 4 or 5 ships in a single night before slipping away into the darkness. The escorts would race around frantically, dropping depth charges blindly, never knowing that the attacker was on the surface, invisible to their detection gear, already miles away. In October 1940, the first true coordinated wolfpack attack demonstrated just how deadly these tactics could be. 7 U-boats fell upon convoy SC-7, 30 merchant ships plodding westward across the Atlantic. The result was massacre. 20 of the 30 ships went to the bottom. Just days later, another pack hit convoy HX-79 and sent 12 more ships down. The British seemed powerless to stop them. In 1940 alone, U-boats sank 471 ships, totaling 2.2 million tons. The exchange rate was grotesquely one-sided. For every U-boat lost, dozens of merchant ships were destroyed. The German submariners felt invincible. They had refined their craft through years of training, development, and now combat experience. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded the U-boat arm, had developed the Rudel tactic, the wolfpack tactics, during the interwar years. The concept drew on the hunting behavior of wolves. A single U-boat would locate a convoy and shadow it from beyond visual range, radioing regular reports back to headquarters. Dönitz and his staff would plot the convoy's course and speed, then vector other U-boats in the area toward the target. When enough submarines had gathered, they would attack together, overwhelming the escorts with multiple threats from different directions. No convoy escort force, no matter how skilled, could defend against attacks coming from all points of the compass simultaneously. The U-boat commanders saw themselves as elite warriors, naval versions of fighter aces. They had their own codes of honor. Many of them, including Kretschmer, refused to fire on passenger liners or hospital ships. They saw themselves as fighting a clean war against military targets and merchant shipping, not as killers of civilians. This distinction, noble as it might have seemed to them, made little practical difference. Britain needed those merchant ships. Every tanker sent to the bottom was oil that couldn't reach British tanks or aircraft. Every freighter full of food was another step towards starvation for the British people. The U-boats were slowly strangling Britain, and they were winning. Then, gradually, things began to change. The first hints came in the spring of 1941, though the U-boat commanders didn't immediately recognize what was happening. Convoys that intelligence said should be in a certain area would appear somewhere else entirely. Patrol lines carefully positioned across expected convoy routes found nothing but empty ocean. Ships that should have sailed into their waiting arms somehow slipped past, taking different routes. It was frustrating and puzzling, but not yet alarming. The Atlantic was vast. Convoys could take multiple routes. Finding them had always involved considerable luck. The March 1941 loss of three of the most successful U-boat commanders, the Aces, was a shock. Günther Prien in U-47, who had sunk the Royal Oak at Scapa Flow, was killed when his boat was destroyed by the British destroyer Wolverine. Joachim Schepke died when his U-100 was rammed and cut in half by the destroyer Vanoc. Most stunning of all, the seemingly invincible Otto Kretschmer was captured when U-99 was forced to surface after being depth-charged by the destroyer Walker. The three top U-boat commanders, lost in the span of 3 weeks, it seemed like terrible luck, a reminder that even the best could die in this brutal war. What the Germans didn't know, couldn't know, was that British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had broken the German naval Enigma cipher. The intelligence from these decrypts, codenamed Ultra, was the most closely guarded secret of the war. The British knew where the U-boat patrol lines were forming. They knew the courses and speeds the submarines were ordered to maintain. Armed with this information, the Admiralty could route convoys around the waiting wolfpacks, or concentrate escort forces where attacks were most likely. The U-boats were hunting blind while their prey could see them coming. But even Ultra was only part of the picture. The British were developing new technologies at a frantic pace. Technologies that would transform the Battle of the Atlantic from a one-sided slaughter into something very different. The U-boat commanders, growing frustrated as their once easy pickings became harder and harder to find, had no idea what was coming. In research laboratories across Britain, scientists and engineers were working on devices that would make the invisible visible. One of these was an improvement to ASDIC. The early war versions had been primitive, unreliable, easily confused by temperature layers in the water, schools of fish, or currents and eddies. The operators needed extensive training and experience to distinguish a real submarine contact from the dozens of false echoes that filled the ocean. But by 1942, improved ASDIC sets were being fitted to escort vessels. These new systems were more powerful, more reliable, more sensitive. They could detect submarines at greater ranges and track them with more accuracy. Equally important, a new generation of operators was being trained. Men who understood the equipment and could read the patterns on their screens with the skill of master musicians reading a score. More revolutionary still was the development of centimetric radar. The breakthrough came in February 1940 when two scientists at Birmingham University, John Randall and Harry Boot, perfected the cavity magnetron. This small device could generate high-power microwave frequencies at wavelengths of just 10 centimeters. Compared to the 1.5-meter wavelengths of earlier radars, the difference was transformative. A radar with a 10-centimeter wavelength could detect objects as small as 10 centimeters, using an antenna small enough to fit on an aircraft or a ship's mast. It could see a submarine's periscope poking above the waves. It could spot a snorkel tube. Most importantly, it could detect a surfaced U-boat at night or in fog, conditions that had previously made the submarines nearly invincible. By late 1941, this new Type 271 radar was being installed on escort vessels. In November of that year, a corvette equipped with the new radar located and helped sink U-433 near Gibraltar. It was the first kill, but there would be many more. By May 1942, 236 ships carried the centimetric radar. The implications were staggering. The U-boat's greatest advantage, their ability to attack on the surface at night, invisible to ASDIC, was suddenly gone. The escorts could see them coming from miles away, even in pitch darkness or heavy fog. The hunters were becoming the hunted, though most of them didn't yet realize it. Even more dangerous to the U-boats was another British innovation, one with a cheerful, almost silly nickname that disguised its lethality. Huff-Duff, officially called high-frequency direction finding, or HFDF. The wolfpack tactics that had been so successful depended absolutely on radio communication. A U-boat spotting a convoy would broadcast its position to headquarters. Dönitz and his staff would respond with orders, directing other boats to converge on the target. The submarines communicated constantly, reporting weather, fuel status, torpedo expenditures, requesting instructions. The Germans had developed burst transmission techniques that could send a complete coded message in less than 20 seconds. They believed this was too short for the British to get a fix on their location. They were wrong. The British had developed a direction-finding system that could determine a bearing to a transmitting submarine almost instantly. Huff-Duff used a special antenna arrangement called an adcock array, 4 vertical antennas connected in pairs, coupled with a cathode ray oscilloscope that displayed the signal as a visual pattern. An experienced operator could read the bearing to a transmitting U-boat in seconds, fast enough to catch even the shortest burst transmission. The bearing would be plotted on a chart. If 2 or more ships or shore stations picked up the same transmission, they could triangulate the U-boat's position with surprising accuracy. Starting in 1942, Huff-Duff sets were installed on convoy escort vessels. This changed everything. When a U-boat began shadowing a convoy, following it over the horizon and radioing reports, the escorts would pick up the transmissions and plot the shadower's position. Aircraft could be sent to drive the submarine down and force it to lose contact. The convoy could change course, evading the gathering wolfpack. Or, if the escort commander felt aggressive, he could order a destroyer or corvette to race out at full speed in the direction of the transmission, forcing the shadowing U-boat to dive and lose the convoy, breaking the carefully coordinated attack before it could develop. The U-boat commanders began to notice that something was wrong. Convoys seemed to detect them before they got close. Escorts would appear suddenly, racing toward them at high speed, forcing emergency dives. Aircraft would arrive out of nowhere, exactly where they were transmitting from, dropping bombs and forcing them under. The radio messages that were supposed to coordinate their attacks were somehow giving them away. Some commanders suspected radio direction finding, but the speed with which the British reacted seemed impossible. The burst transmissions were so short. How could anyone get a bearing that quickly? Many U-boat commanders began to suspect that their METOX radar warning receivers were somehow betraying their positions. METOX could detect the 1.5-meter wavelength radar that the British had been using, giving the U-boats warning when aircraft were approaching. But METOX, like many radio receivers, emitted weak signals of its own. In the spring and summer of 1943, when U-boat losses began mounting catastrophically, a captured British officer told his German interrogators that RAF Coastal Command was detecting the METOX emissions and homing in on them. The Germans tested this claim and found it was technically possible. In August 1943, Dönitz ordered all U-boats to shut off their METOX receivers immediately. It was a lie, a brilliant piece of deception. The British weren't detecting METOX emissions at all. They were using their new 10-centimeter radar, which METOX couldn't detect, and they were using Huff-Duff to locate transmitting U-boats. But the lie worked perfectly. The Germans wasted months developing new radar warning receivers that didn't emit signals, when the real problem was that the British had moved to a completely different radar wavelength that the German equipment couldn't detect at all. By the time the Germans realized what was actually happening, it was far too late. The U-boats had been blind for months, operating without radar warning in seas patrolled by aircraft they couldn't detect until bombs were already falling around them. The British had one more weapon in their arsenal, a device that looked strange and ungainly but proved devastatingly effective. They called it the Hedgehog. It was a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar that fired 24 small bombs ahead of the attacking ship. Previous anti-submarine attacks had used depth charges rolled off the stern or fired from throwers on the sides of the ship. This created multiple problems. The attacking ship had to pass directly over the submarine's position, during which time the submarine disappeared from the ASDIC, creating a blind period that skilled U-boat commanders exploited by making sharp turns and speed changes. The depth charges were set to explode at predetermined depths, so if the attacking crew guessed wrong about how deep the submarine had gone, the charges would explode harmlessly above or below the target, and the explosions themselves created tremendous turbulence and noise in the water that blinded the ASDIC for up to half an hour, giving the submarine time to escape. The Hedgehog solved all these problems at once. It fired ahead of the ship while the submarine was still clearly visible on the ASDIC, giving the sub no warning and no time for evasive maneuvers. The bombs used contact fuses instead of depth fuses. They only exploded when they hit something solid, like a submarine's hull. A direct hit by even 1 or 2 Hedgehog bombs was almost always fatal, and if the bombs missed, they sank to the bottom and never exploded at all, leaving the water clear and quiet so that ASDIC could maintain contact and another attack could be made immediately. The statistics were stark. Depth charges achieved a kill rate of 1 submarine for every 60 attacks. Hedgehog achieved 1 kill for every 6 attacks. It was 10 times more effective. The destroyer escort USS England would later demonstrate just how deadly Hedgehog could be, sinking 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days in May 1944. When these weapons were combined with the new radar, improved ASDIC, and Huff-Duff, they created an anti-submarine warfare system that was orders of magnitude more effective than anything that had existed before. And the British kept the capabilities of these systems secret as long as possible, which meant that German U-boat tactics didn't adapt to meet the threat until far too late. By early 1943, the U-boats were operating in an environment that had transformed completely, though many of them didn't fully understand what had changed. The wolfpack tactics required communication, but every transmission gave away their position. Surface running at night, their greatest tactical advantage, exposed them to radar-equipped aircraft and escorts that could see them from miles away in the darkest night. When they dove to attack or evade, the improved ASDIC could track them with precision, and the Hedgehog could kill them while they were still maneuvering to escape. March 1943 would mark the peak of the Battle of the Atlantic, at least from the German perspective. That month saw the largest convoy battle of the entire war, when wolfpacks fell upon convoys HX 229 and SC 122, sinking 21 ships. The Germans lost only 1 U-boat. It seemed like the happy time might be returning. Donitz had more submarines than ever before, over 100 operational boats at sea. The shipyards were producing new boats faster than the Allies could sink them. Victory seemed possible, even likely. If they could just sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, if they could interdict enough supplies, Britain might still be forced to negotiate. But March was a high water mark, the last gasp of German success in the Atlantic. What followed would be catastrophic. April saw losses on both sides, but with the strategic momentum shifting subtly in the Allies' favour. The British were building escorts faster than they could be sunk. American shipyards were producing merchant vessels at an astounding rate. Long-range Liberator bombers were beginning to close the mid-Atlantic gap, that stretch of ocean that had been beyond the range of land-based aircraft where U-boats could surface and operate with relative safety. New escort carriers were being commissioned, providing air cover even in mid-ocean. The technological improvements were being deployed across the board. More ships had radar, more ships had Huff-Duff, more ships had Hedgehog. The crews were getting better, more experienced, more confident. And then came May. Convoy ONS 5 departed Liverpool on April 21, 1943, 43 merchant ships bound for Halifax in ballast or carrying exports. It was escorted by 16 warships, a substantial force. Intelligence indicated heavy U-boat concentrations in the North Atlantic. As the convoy steamed westward, over 40 submarines were manoeuvring to intercept it, the largest concentration of U-boats ever assembled against a single convoy. For the Germans, it should have been a triumph. The numbers were on their side. Over 40 U-boats against 43 merchant ships. The mathematics of war suggested a massacre. The U-boats made first contact on April 28th in the middle of a full Atlantic gale. The weather was so terrible that long-range liberators couldn't fly, and one of the escort groups couldn't even find the convoy in the storm. For a brief time, it seemed like conditions favoured the Germans, but on May 1st the U-boats lost contact with ONS 5 in the terrible weather. The convoy had effectively disappeared into the storm. 3 days passed. The frustrated U-boat commanders searched the empty ocean using precious fuel while the convoy steamed onward. They found it again on May 4th. What followed was a running battle that lasted 3 days and 3 nights, a struggle that would later be seen as the turning point of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. The Germans attacked with everything they had. Over the night of May 4th, they sank 5 merchant ships, a significant success. But the escorts were fighting back with a coordination and effectiveness that the U-boat commanders had never experienced before. The escorts used Huff-Duff to locate every transmitting U-boat and sent ships racing to force them under. Aircraft working with the convoy used radar to detect surface submarines and attack them before they could get into position. When the U-boats dove, the improved ASDIC tracked them relentlessly, and Hedgehog killed them with shocking efficiency. On the night of May 5th, 6, the Germans tried their heaviest attack, coming from every direction at once in the classic wolfpack tactic. It should have overwhelmed the defences. Instead, it was the U-boats that were overwhelmed. That single night, 4 submarines were sunk. U-125 destroyed by a Hedgehog attack from the destroyer Vedette. U-438 depth-charged by the sloop Pelican. U-531 rammed by the destroyer Oribi. U-638 sunk by the corvette Loosestrife. The next day, reinforcements arrived, and Dönitz called off the attack. The final tally was sobering. The convoy had lost 13 ships, a painful loss, but the U-boats had lost 6 submarines sunk and 7 more seriously damaged. That was an exchange rate of barely 2 merchant ships per U-boat lost. The wolfpacks needed to sink at least 4 or 5 ships for every submarine lost just to break even. This was a disaster. And ONS 5 was just the beginning. The next convoy's attack suffered even worse. SC-130, assaulted by over 30 U-boats, lost not a single ship while 5 U-boats were destroyed. One of those lost was U-954, commanded by Peter Dönitz, the admiral's son. The wolfpacks were being slaughtered. Convoy after convoy got through with minimal losses while U-boat after U-boat failed to return to base. By the end of May 1943, 41 U-boats had been destroyed, a quarter of all operational submarines. Nothing like this had ever happened before. The monthly loss rate had been 10 or 15 boats. To lose 41 in a single month was catastrophic. These weren't just machines being lost. They were experienced crews, trained commanders, veterans who had survived multiple patrols and learned the harsh lessons of war at sea. The U-boat arm was bleeding out. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered the U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic. The wolfpacks were pulled back, sent to less dangerous waters while new tactics and technologies could be developed. In his private messages and war diary, Dönitz was brutally honest. They had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The British and Americans had won. The U-boat commanders who survived tried to understand what had happened. They knew about radar now. Captured equipment had shown them the British were using 10-centimetre radar that their warning receivers couldn't detect. They suspected direction finding had been used against them, though they didn't fully understand how effective Huff-Duff had been. They knew the escorts had become more aggressive, more capable, but they didn't know all the details about improved ASDIC and Hedgehog. What they understood clearly was that hunting in the North Atlantic had changed from a relatively safe mission into a suicide run. Submarines that had once operated with impunity now risked destruction every time they surfaced. The escorts that had once seemed helpless now hunted them with deadly precision. Aircraft appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the night, radar allowing them to see what human eyes could not. The ocean that had once seemed vast enough to hide in was now a trap where every transmission gave away their position. Every time they surfaced, they were visible, and when they dove, sound waves painted their location for the escorts hunting them. The Germans would develop countermeasures. Radar warning receivers that could detect the 10-centimeter radar, acoustic torpedoes that homed in on the sound of a ship's propellers, the snorkel, a breathing tube that allowed diesel engines to run while submerged, reducing the need to surface. Better anti-aircraft guns to fight back against attacking planes, but all of these innovations came too late to change the outcome of the battle. The statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, U-boats sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. In 1943, that number dropped to under 3 million tons, and most of those losses occurred in the first 5 months of the year. Meanwhile, U-boat losses skyrocketed. 241 U-boats were destroyed in 1943 alone, more than all previous years of the war combined. The exchange rate had reversed completely. Now the Allies were sinking U-boats faster than Germany could build them, while Allied shipyards were producing cargo vessels at a rate the submarines could never hope to match. The transformation wasn't just technological, though the technology was crucial. It was also operational and tactical. The Allies had created a system that integrated all their advantages into a seamless whole. Code breaking provided strategic intelligence that allowed convoys to avoid wolfpack patrol lines. Huff-Duff provided tactical warning of submarine positions. Radar allowed detection in all weather conditions, day or night. Improved ASDIC tracked submarines underwater with precision. Hedgehog killed them efficiently. Long-range aircraft closed the Atlantic gap. Escort carriers provided air cover in mid-ocean. The escorts themselves were better, more numerous, more experienced, and perhaps most important, the Allies had the industrial capacity to sustain this effort and expand it indefinitely. The German U-boat commanders who had been so confident in 1940, who had seen themselves as masters of the Atlantic, hunting at will against helpless prey, found themselves in a fundamentally different war by 1943. They were now the prey. Every patrol became a test of survival. The odds that had once favoured them now worked against them. Of the roughly 39,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, 28,000 died. That's a casualty rate of over 70%, the highest of any branch of service in any nation during the entire war. The U-boats went from being Germany's most effective weapon against Britain to a force that consumed men and resources while accomplishing less and less. What the U-boat commanders never fully realised was how comprehensively they had been outfought, not just in terms of courage or skill, which they had in abundance, but in the realm of science and technology. The British, fighting for their survival, had invested everything in the research and development needed to win the Battle of the Atlantic. They had turned their universities into weapons laboratories, recruited their brightest scientists and engineers, and given them the resources and urgency needed to innovate faster than the enemy could adapt. The cavity magnetron that made centimetric radar possible, the oscilloscope and adcock antenna that made Huff-Duff so effective, the contact-fused Hedgehog bombs, the improved ASDIC and the operators trained to use it with precision, the long-range liberators that closed the Atlantic gap, the escort carriers that brought air power to mid-ocean. None of these innovations alone would have been decisive, but deployed together, integrated into a comprehensive anti-submarine warfare system, supported by code-breaking intelligence and overwhelming industrial production, they created conditions under which the U-boats simply could not win. The German submariners had been warriors in a war that was ultimately decided by scientists, engineers, and factory workers. For all their skill and courage, for all the hardships they endured in their steel tubes beneath the sea, they were fighting blind against an enemy that could see them coming, locate them when they transmitted, detect them when they surfaced, track them when they dove, and kill them with weapons they often never saw or heard until it was too late. The happy time, that brief period when U-boat commanders hunted with impunity and sank ships at will, was over. It would never return. The Battle of the Atlantic continued until the last days of the war, and U-boats continued to sail and fight and die. But after May 1943, they were never again a strategic threat to Britain's survival. The island fortress remained supplied, the armies in Europe remained supported, and the invasion forces gathered for D-Day knew that their supply lines across the Atlantic were secure. For the U-boat commanders, the war had become a nightmare from which they couldn't wake. They went out on patrol knowing the odds were against them. They transmitted messages knowing those transmissions might betray their positions. They surfaced knowing they might be visible to radar-equipped aircraft in the darkness. They dove knowing improved sonar might track them to their deaths. And the technology that had defeated them remained partially mysterious until the war's end. They knew they were being detected, located, and killed with unprecedented efficiency. But many of the specific details of how it was being done remained secret. It was only after the war, when the full story began to emerge, that the surviving U-boat commanders understood just how thoroughly they had been outmatched. The 10-centimeter radar that made them visible at night, the Huff-Duff that painted their positions from their own transmissions, the ultra-intelligence that read their orders before they received them, the Hedgehog that killed without warning. All of these secrets, kept so carefully during the war, had worked together to turn the hunters into hunted. The German U-boat captains truly never knew what hit them. They sailed into battle confident in their skills, their boats, and their tactics. They discovered too late that they were fighting a war where the fundamental rules had changed beneath them. The invisible enemy they hunted had learned to see in the dark, to hear their whispers across the ocean, to know where they would be before they arrived, and to kill them with a precision that left no room for error or escape. It was a defeat written in technology and mathematics, as inexorable as the tides and as unforgiving as the cold Atlantic itself.